There's not too many times when I'm glad that someone has died. But, and that's a strong but, Zbigniew Brzezinski dying is an end to a monster who should have been in prison years ago for crimes against humanity. This man's actions and the policies that he helped implement has had a ripple effect around the world that is still felt to this day. The legacy media, like it always does when one of these Cold War warriors die, is fawning over Brzezinski's death, saying what a great man he was, and is glossing over the crimes this man has committed in the names of peace. In 1976, Jimmy Carter was elected to the presidency after Nixon's former Vice President Gerald Ford failed to win over the American public hungry for change on the domestic front. While former President Jimmy Carter is often remembered as a man of peace during his presidency and his term in office, it was anything but peaceful. The reason for this was Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1928, according to his official biography. Now, other sources speculate that he was actually born in a Polish consulate in the Ukrainian town of Kharkov, which at the time was a part of the USSR, but his parents registered him as having been born in Poland and not the Soviet Union. He then emigrated with his parents to the United States. Historically, Poland and Russia have always been at odds, and Brzezinski put the historic blood feud of his mother country ahead of the interests of the United States. He openly opposed Nixon and Ford's policy of detente and orchestrated the use of American power to arm and fund all those who sought to undermine the Soviet Union. This action alone would bring some devastating consequences. Because of a 1973 coup in Afghanistan, it had led to a new secular government that was leaning heavily towards the Soviets. The US wanted to undermine this new government by organizing multiple coup attempts through America's lackey states at the time, Pakistan and Iran, which was under the control of the Shah at this point in history. In July of 1979, Brzezinski officially authorized aid to the mujahideen rebels in Afghanistan to be delivered through the CIA's program, Operation Cyclone. And this is why I continue to say that the CIA is an unconstitutional organization that should have been disbanded years ago. And in recent years, the CIA's very existence relies on the idea of a Russian threat, and has been evidenced by the agency's complete assault on the Trump administration whenever it appears that detente is possible with the former Soviet Union. But I digress. Brzezinski's policies helped to fund, arm, and train Osama bin Laden, the founder of the Salafist terror group, al-Qaeda. The group later orchestrated and executed 9/11, if you believe the official story. Brzezinski's jihadists took over the country in the 1990s. They later executed and then mutilated the corpse of Afghanistan's pro-Soviet president, Dr Mohammad Najibullah, in 1996. Brzezinski's policies in Afghanistan would later be responsible for unleashing jihadi terrorism throughout the wider world. But many of America's political elite, on the left and the right, continue to defend America's decision to arm the mujahideen in Afghanistan because they thought it was necessary to defend the country and the region as a whole against quote-unquote Soviet aggression. However, Brzezinski's own statements directly contradict America's official story in relation to what happened at the time. In a 1998 interview, Brzezinski admitted that in conducting this operation, the Carter administration had knowingly increased the probability that the Soviets would intervene militarily, suggesting they began arming the Islamic factions before the Soviets invaded, making the rationale null and void since there was no invasion in Afghanistan to begin with. So the freedom fighters needing to repel the Soviets was a lie. Brzezinski then said, regret what? That secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap, and you want me to regret it? The day the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter, we now have the opportunity of giving the USSR its Vietnam War. This statement went further than merely boasting about the instigation of war that ultimately collapsed the Soviet Union. And if you need any more proof, Robert Gates, former CIA director under Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and former Secretary of Defense under both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, directly confirmed in his memoir entitled From the Shadows that the covert operation began 6 months prior to the invasions of the Soviet, with the actual intention of luring the Soviets into a Vietnam-style quagmire. Brzezinski knew exactly what he was doing. The Soviets were then bogged down in Afghanistan for 10 years, fighting an endless supply of American-supplied weapons and trained fighters. At the time, the media went so far as to laud Osama bin Laden as a freedom fighter, fighting for his country's independence from Soviet aggression. He was one of the most influential figures in Brzezinski's covert operation. And we all know how that story ended. Even with the full knowledge of what his CIA-funded creation had become, in a 1998 interview, Brzezinski said, what is most important to the history of the world? The Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? Well, flash forward to 2017, and the Cold War has not ended. Russophobic behavior is rife within the American political elite, and you would believe that the Soviet Union hadn't collapsed. NATO is amassing on Russia's borders. You have uncontrolled migration into Europe from the third world, countries bringing their tribalistic mentality with them. Terror attacks all throughout Western Europe and the world as a whole. Marxist ideology rife in the US, as well as the US and its allies still funding and arming terror groups for their own geopolitical purposes, which in turn are destroying their countries. So ask yourselves, if our history books are honest, which event will become the most important moment in our history? Brzezinski's support led directly to the creation of al-Qaeda, led to the Soviet invasion, led to the creation of the Taliban, which is fighting in an endless war with NATO forces. He was a strong supporter of the 2014 coup against the legitimate Ukrainian government, and more recently said, before his death, that the Russian Federation would break up. He also said that the US must help all those wanting to break it up, irrespective of who they are, showing us that he has not learned his lesson from arming and funding fanatical groups. He continued to advocate sanctions against Russia until his dying day, in spite of the fact that the sanctions ended up hurting his native Poland more than the Russian Federation he sought to destroy. Brzezinski died safely in a hospital bed, unlike the millions of displaced and murdered civilians who were pawns in Brzezinski's twisted geopolitical chess game of blood and lunacy. Brzezinski was a deeply violent and hateful man. His legacy is one of militant jihadism, the formation of al-Qaeda, one of the most devastating terror attacks on U.S. soil, and the complete denigration of Russia as an everlasting adversary with which peace cannot and should not ever be obtained. He was a monster, and the world is a better place with him gone. I'm the Millennial Revolt. Thank you guys so much for watching, and you have a wonderful day. Bye.